Welcome to The Cusp, a podcast that tries to give you the straight dope on what's actually happening with artificial intelligence, how jobs are changing, and what that means for education and workforce development. I'm Paul Fain, editor of the Job newsletter and co-founder of WorkShift. Thanks for listening. Welcome back. This episode features two interviews. I'm excited to share both of them with you. First up is Ben Armstrong, executive director and a research scientist at MIT's Industrial Performance Center, where he co-leads the Work of the Future initiative. Ben's research examines how workers, firms, and regions adapt to technological change. His current projects include a working group on generative AI and its impact on jobs. Through that work, Ben and his colleagues are truly at the cutting edge of understanding what's really happening with Gen AI. I also spoke with Katy, executive director and president of the Siegel Family Endowment, which seeks to understand and shape the impact of technology on society. The endowment also supports organizations that work at the intersection of learning, the workforce, and infrastructure. In this interview, Katy helps us make sense of the research out of MIT and to think about how educators can best meet this moment. All right, let's get to the conversation. I'm here with Dr. Ben Armstrong. Ben, thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
So I wonder if we could just start by getting a sense of your research and what you're tracking most closely right now on the impacts of generative AI.
We started some research last summer where we heard a lot of the hype that this technology was the most significant in our generation, that it was going to transform worker productivity. There was some worries, as I'm sure you've chronicled, about huge numbers of jobs being displaced. And from my perspective, I've been studying automation in work and mostly in manufacturing contexts, kind of the displacement of, or the transformation, I should say, of middle skill jobs. I was wondering whether this was actually the case. We had heard this story before around robots, in 2018, the famous paper from Frey and Osborne suggesting that 47% of all jobs are vulnerable to automation by 2030, which of course, is not, never came to pass and turns out to be kind of just a flawed methodology. But it seemed like the same cycle of hype and dread in some cases was repeating itself. I would say furious optimism, but also some pretty serious pessimism. So what we wanted to do in beginning last summer was to cut through some of that hype and understand how this technology was actually playing out in the field. So we started reaching out to companies that were experimenting with generative AI and that had worked with various more narrow AI applications in the past. And we asked them if they would want to participate in case studies, if we could track how they were using the technology. So we hopped on dozens and dozens of mostly Zoom calls to do interviews with these companies, heads of data science, heads of HR, to really get a sense of what this technology was doing out in the field and what the vision was for these companies, how they imagined it could transform different jobs. And that's really what we've been working on for the past 6 months or so. We have a team of about a dozen people at MIT, mostly engineers, computer science types, some social scientists like myself. And it's been a really exciting process so far where we've engaged with somewhere around 40, 50 companies, mostly large Fortune 500 types. And then we have a set of about a dozen more intensive case studies where we're looking at how different occupations have the potential to be changed. And what I would say, if I'm just summarizing what we've learned so far,
Sure.
is that a lot of the changes with this technology look really similar to changes from past technologies. Of course, there's a lot of early investment and a lot of speed with which companies are trying to deploy LLM-based tools, but it doesn't seem so dramatically different than the adoption of personal computers or the adoption and deployment of new internet or cloud-based tools into the workplace, as far as we can tell so far. Now, the critique of that, of course, is like, it's early, it's only a year and
Right.
a half in, but it does seem like the effect on jobs so far and the roadmap, I would say maybe a year out, has been very incremental.
Have you found a range of kind of urgency, seriousness among companies in that group? They don't feel to me like they're talking publicly about this with much detail. So I'm really curious, just generally what you're hearing. And if, some companies are dramatically different than others, even in the same industry.
So I wouldn't divide it as much by industry as by, so think about department within the company. So you look at HR or marketing, there are kind of low hanging fruit type tasks within those functions that have been the targets for a lot of generative AI applications. Now, I would say that doesn't mean, I know some folks have predicted that this would mean a huge loss in jobs in those departments. I don't think that's necessarily the case because a lot of the, let's say, marketing applications are new content, right? This is more additive than it is strictly replacement or automation.
Right.
So I think departments within firms are certainly targets. And then we see a lot of similar applications across industries. So knowledge management is a big application that we see that manufacturing companies are thinking about the same ways as insurance companies. How do we take a lot of our company's protocols, our company's historical contracts, and what we've learned, what's kind of the wisdom in the minds of our 30 plus year tenured employees, and make sure that that's part of our training materials. It's part of what a junior employee receives as well. And it turns out that's a really hard nut to crack because it's a, you want to transfer that information with high fidelity, and you also don't want to disrupt the learning process. You don't want it to be, oh, I'm just going to rely on the bot and I'm not going to actually learn and internalize this information. So it's been a really interesting balancing act there. But yeah, I don't think there's a huge gap in terms of industry. Of course, there are some companies that have been experimenting early and often and are more open to trying things out. But I don't think it really breaks down by industry as cleanly as you might think.
Right. Obviously, these are large organizations as well. So it makes sense that the kind of department levels where you see the differences. But, in terms of occupations in particular, where you're seeing the most interesting change or possibilities, can you give us a sense there of the flavor?
Certainly. So I'll start with an occupation that has been covered widely, and that's medical professionals, clinicians, doctors, nurses. For the past decade or more, you've seen a lot of new, we'll call it narrow AI and machine learning technologies, just algorithms trying to support improve patient care, improve decision making, and reduce burnout for doctors and nurses. So, how do we help them make better decisions to reduce the cost of care, like predicting when someone should be discharged, for example, or low risk treatment options, that sort of thing. A popular example is algorithms reading radiology scans that might be able to do it more effective than doctors. Those are all the narrow AI applications that have been deployed in the past. And my colleague Kate Kellogg at MIT Sloan School has done some really fascinating work on, even when those technologies are better, that are really high quality, essentially perform better on tests than doctors still might resist using them, or it might be hard for doctors to make sense of the output of the algorithm in the right context. So even when we know that this technology can be effective at a task, it's oftentimes hard to integrate it into the workflow. So that's one hypothesis that we had walking into this, is like, yeah, even if generative AI might be great for doctors, it might actually be hard for them to figure out ways to make use of it. And that is what we're, I would say in general, what we're finding. So I'll give you two applications of how medical professionals are using these tools, seem to be using these tools, and one that seems to be more successful than the other. So one is, and I'll start with the more successful, is note taking. So when you go to the doctor, it used to be, for me at least, the doctor would sit at their computer terminal, and as they're talking to me, they're taking notes on what I'm saying and kind of chronicling the visit that way. And I think
Right.
that's still the case for a lot of doctors. But some hospital systems have started using an ambient note taking program where the doctor might come in with a tablet, ask you if it's okay to record, click the record button, and the recording of your visit goes up, somewhere into the cloud. And one of two things might happen. In some cases, offshore call center type environment with people who are trained medically in some way will take the recording and use the transcription and turn it into a note that they can then summarize and tag for insurance purposes. There's
Right.
now a new system from a group called Nuance that will summarize using generative AI the transcription of the audio. So that's an automatic summary that can go into your note just a few minutes after the visit is complete. And this is a tool that is intended, and I think can really reduce they call pajama time for doctors, the time after their clinical visits that has been drudgery in a lot of cases.
Right.
Reduce the time that the doctors perform those tasks and free them up more to just focus on the patient during the visit. So this is I think, very popular from what my colleagues have reported so far, and seems to be a really positive way of transforming the work of a doctor maybe not into something a brand new medical profession, but instead to get it back toward focus on patient care and reducing the factors that contribute to burnout. Now, there's a second set of applications, and this is more focused on what's arisen since the pandemic, which is now instead of going into the doctor, a lot of people just prefer to email with their medical concerns. Maybe they attach a picture and they pose medical questions via their whatever electronic health records interface might be.
Probably
Uh,
buttressed by their own searching on the web, which is a thing in
Yeah,
health.
maybe you link to your Google results, whatever it is. And what's been interesting is that there's the idea from the EHR provider Epic that generative AI can really help with this. And what it can do is it can maybe suggest responses to, any patient question, medical question you might have. But this hasn't been a huge hit with doctors that we've seen in some early evidence, in part because the hospital systems want to be very cautious with what is actually suggested. Is there medical advice that the algorithm's providing?
Right.
Patients probably don't, they want their doctor to be providing the medical advice, not the algorithm.
Right.
And if it's not providing medical advice, its usefulness might be more limited. So there's really a difficult integration problem with this in-basket messaging and when it's prompting doctors with potential responses that we see in early, I would say very early evidence has hit more roadblocks than the summarization work.
It makes sense to me that healthcare would be an industry that you're seeing the most potential change. Obviously, with the burnout and the labor crisis in healthcare, it's where the most change I report on of all industries. But, I wonder, we struggle, to be honest with you. Medical imaging is an area where I think a lot of people are expecting changes to occupations based on AI and the potential there for obvious reasons, but struggling to really see specifically how it might change jobs for rad techs, if it's happening at all. And I wonder, do you see possibilities there? I mean, if you can get the sense that this could change those jobs dramatically and maybe open up, more entry level frontline workers to doing things that are different, freeing up some of the drudgery to skills that were higher level. Is there a potential there in allied health generally?
So I don't. So the first answer is I don't think we know yet, but I could imagine a couple different paths that we go down, and this is really the two possible futures that people are seeing. One is a future where expertise, let's say the domain expertise, is at even more of a premium. So even though you have an algorithm that can help you read a scan, the value isn't necessarily on someone who knows the process around scan reading, but can have the algorithm read the scan for them, which might be the lower skilled person who's entry level, call it future one. It's instead the person who's seen so many scans that can tell when the algorithm gets it wrong. So there's someone who's doing the ultimate checking and has the expertise and also can understand perhaps why this is perceived as anomalous, like can spot the anomaly even if the algorithm is a black box and can't tell you on its own.
Right.
So to give you another example of this, if you have, for example, someone who's programming, you might find that a software engineer who knows the architecture that they want and has seen very high quality code in a similar application in the past is more equipped to respond and see if the generative AI's output is going to be useful than a junior engineer who's never seen this type of application before and who doesn't actually have a lot of experience knowing what good code looks like. Similarly, you might think that expert is going to be beneficial in radiology. So I would say that future one is domain expertise is more important than ever because you need someone to be able to check the results and confirm the results of the algorithm. Future two is to say, okay, yeah, you probably need these experts at some point in the firm, but these experts are going to be so productive and can handle only these off cases in rare cases that really the more workers that you're going to need are, lower skilled folks at the entry level who can rely on algorithms to help climb the learning curve, like you're suggesting. And we see early evidence of this from call centers, where in an experiment from Danielle Lee at Sloan and Eric Brynjolfsson and
Yep.
others, where they saw that junior call center workers who were trained to work with an algorithm were able to perform like far more senior colleagues with
Right.
about a year of experience in, only a matter of a few months. Now, it's unclear whether they had any kind of superpowers, whether they could outperform those expert colleagues with the LLMs. It only seemed that they seemed to perform like more experienced colleagues. Now, The question then is, what's a task that looks more like software engineering, where you might really need this domain expertise for a long time, or what looks more like call center workers, where you could kind of perform at a high level even without that expertise?
Right.
And it's unclear what the divide right now looks like.
That's really interesting. I mean, I think for a lot of folks who track workforce development are hopeful that you'll see examples like that call center research. Do you see other
Why do you think that's a good example of, or why
well, that's
workforce
a good
development professionals would want?
good point. I mean, I think the idea being that there's a pretty broad movement to try to open up more good jobs to people without credentials, thinking about like the dropping of 4-year degrees in hiring. And I think the idea, and I don't know if it is actually an accurate application to that research, but that folks could get better at their jobs with less kind of licensing and credential barriers. Does that resonate
Yeah,
as a possibility for you?
I think about it as the inverse. What you're suggesting, which I think could be interesting, is that could we use LLM based tools for skill development? So
Right.
essentially, is what's happening with the call center workers that what I think is happening with the call center workers, for example, and just to be clear, these call center workers that have 3 months of experience but are performing at a high level as if they had 12 months of experience. I don't think that reflects the call center workers actually having significantly more skills at the job. It's unclear
Right.
whether they've internalized the skills. Instead, what they have is they have a window on the side of their screen that helps them respond, that kind of gives them the alley oop so they can go and perform the task. I think instead, if you really can slot anyone in, if you're a call center manager and you can slot anyone in, and in 3 months they're going to be an expert, that means that your skills are very replaceable. So I
Yeah.
don't think there's a reason then for you to get wage premium
Right.
over time to move up a career ladder and really get a good job. I think the path to good jobs, as it's always been, is going to be skill dependent. So if you're going
Right.
to develop more skills and more domain expertise, you're going to be able to demand more wages in the market. So for for me, if I put a workforce development hat on, what I want to train students for are jobs that are going to require domain expertise and require a lot of learning and training, not jobs that are going to be more commodified. So the early concern about, like, let's take another example, which is essentially press release writing, which is
Mhm.
my colleagues Shiked Noy and Whitney Zhang wrote about. And I think you could look at that. The finding is very much like the call center, where people who are writing a press release with generative AI were perceived as higher quality, and they did it much faster than those without generative AI. And then the worst writers also got a bigger bump from generative AI.
Right.
And generative AI essentially brought them to the median. Is compressing the skill level. Now, for you know workforce development, you might be concerned because this is commodifying the task of writing, something that we've been trying to teach people to be good at for a long time. On the other hand, it hasn't commodified good writing, it's commodified mediocre writing. So there's still some returns to being a good writer, and there might actually be more returns to being a good writer because fewer people are incentivized to climb over the hump of being a mediocre writer. So really, I think from the workforce development side, if you're thinking, what do I train my students to go into? What are going to be good jobs? I think the good jobs are going to still be the jobs with a skill premium. Those are jobs with upwardly mobile paths. And then the jobs where you might get, like, not have barriers to entry, but also not really a path upward, are the jobs where a lot of the skills have become commodified. And that might be a more of a call center position. But again, call center jobs are not considered good jobs.
No,
By and large, they're typically
not
low
high
wage, high
wage.
turnover, et cetera.
Yep, for sure. That's so interesting. It absolutely makes sense to me. I guess kind of the predisposition that I have was thinking about the coding piece where, a lower skilled coder, software developer can perform at a higher level. Like we've all seen that. There was a great New Yorker piece about, Requiem for Coding was the title. But in my head, it was so those lower skilled folks will get paid better because they're delivering a higher product, but maybe not.
Well, just thinking about, and this is a concern I know for some computer science colleagues here, is that at a senior level, so I think the prediction, and who knows, right? This is a forecast,
Right.
would be that if an entry level programming job, now you have new tools that could democratize entry level programming. So GitHub Copilot, where now if you didn't know how to do something, you weren't trained in a computer science degree, you might be able to prompt your way to some decent entry level coding. That opens up the potential supply of entry level coders for companies so that supply is increasing. Let's say demand might be decreasing because individuals will be more, producing more code. That's a recipe for wage depression,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
the
Absolutely.
coding jobs actually become less well paying. And now the puzzle for companies is that you still need your senior engineers, your engineering managers, your engineering architects, and those are going to be very well paying, right? Because the domain expertise still
Right.
really matters. But how do you get to train those people if your entry level job is now lower skill and lower paying? So
Yeah.
again, like the potential effect, we haven't really seen this yet, is that the rungs on the career ladder, like some of these begin to decay and you don't really know how to get from a junior position to a more senior.
As you talk, I was thinking about the implications for the legal profession.
Mm,
Again, without knowing anything, I just my kind of inclination is to think that a paralegal could do more high level work, but I actually see a much more likely parallel to what you just described, where it's easier to get that work done without training, maybe have fewer people, and then the higher level lawyer, their job doesn't really change.
yeah, we don't have good data on lawyers yet. The other thing, I think this might be a nice opportunity to talk about what this technology is good at and what it's not good at. Of course,
Yeah.
there's a big frenzy about generative AI in particular. Sometimes it's conflated with AI, and the generative is
Right.
AI, where what I find funny is that if you survey American companies, about like 3 to 5% of them say that they use AI, and it's gone up, but it's still a very small share, when in fact these companies use AI every day in all sorts of things they do. Like it's threaded through their email, it's threaded through, if they use anything with navigation, it's threaded through Google search, right? It's been a part, and my colleague says that once it starts working in your life, you don't call it AI anymore. So really, what this generative AI thing is it's sparking a conversation within a lot of organizations about, like, oh, what could we add more technology to that's currently kind of a drudgery or a pain in the butt process. And in the legal profession, we've seen some of this around kind of contracting, document review, document preparation, that sort of thing. But then when you think about it, the biggest real transformation in the legal profession is just, copy paste and optical character recognition, which has been around for a long time. It's
Right.
like, you have template documents. It's not like you need generative AI to produce a new variation of a particular template or new form filling. That's been around. So sometimes we start talking about these applications without thinking if generative AI is the right technology fit for the task. Some organizations that we've talked to, they've in soul searching around generative AI have found these tasks that certainly could be augmented with technology,
Hmm.
but generative AI is not the appropriate technology at all, right? So it's this type of thing where typically you start with the problem and then you figure out what the most appropriate technology is. Here we're starting with the technology
Right.
oftentimes, then working our way back is, hey, what can we do with this exciting new tool? But to answer your question with lawyers, one of my colleagues, a law professor, has been starting to study this, and his hypothesis, at least, is that there's this bifurcation within law that's been around for a long time, which is kind of prestige, very highly paid law firms, the ones that you see, representing high profile clients, or doing the white shoe work. Those folks have a lot of human interactions and kind of expertise in reasoning that will lead them not really to rely on these tools and not really worry about that, not be augmented that much by this technology. But then you have a bulk of the legal profession that's doing much more routine work, that is trying to get more work out each day, and has kind of a backlog of work for clients, that is variations on the same theme, where generative AI can actually be hugely helpful for summarization. There might be new additions in terms of form filling. So that is what his prediction is, that it'll look very bifurcated in how the tools are used.
Thank you for indulging that. It feels like so much of this I just haven't seen much clear writing about. So it's really exciting to hear you frame this in ways that I have not seen. One of your colleagues, David Otter, had a paper out in February that's getting a lot of attention now, has a somewhat optimistic view of the possibilities for the middle class with Gen AI. I just wonder if you wanted to riff on that a little bit. I know you had a take on skills bias and the potential there. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Sure. If we rewind historically and think about kind of the waves of change, and we can think about it in the United States, but in Europe, it's followed much the same trend. And in the early first half of the 20th century, there was a big compression in wages. Really, I think it was between 1920 and about 1970. Big productivity gains
Yep.
and reducing inequality. And the argument from David Autor and others is that the types of technology that drove productivity gains between 1920 and 1970 were technology that really benefited manual workers and made their skills more relevant. And they benefited, I would say, lower education, lower wage workers more than they did the higher skill, higher wage workers like engineers, lawyers, doctors, et cetera. And what that meant is lowering inequality. So a lot of wages for, you could think about manufacturing workers who made up more than a third of the workforce at the time, their wages were growing quite substantially along with productivity growth. That equation really flipped at somewhere around 1970, 1980, where the new technologies that were introduced in the workforce, you could think the computer, the internet, that those technologies were very skill biased, that they were complementary technologies for people who had a college degree, who were in those types of service professions, and they were competitive technologies with production workers or with workers with lower skills or even secretaries, administrative workers. And that drove a big inequality. What David Autor's argument now is that this might flip us back to where a technology that looks a lot more like technology between 1920 and 1970.
Right.
And the early experimental evidence that we talked about with press release writing and
Mhm.
call center writing is the evidence he points to. I'm not clear that that's the case. And I'm not clear that that's the case, A, because I'm not clear that that's really what was going on 1920, 1970, or afterward. I think offshoring, which David has also written about, it was a huge part in it. I think the role of unions and pressure, even though we were never a hugely unionized country, the pressure from organized labor and how companies adapted to that between 1920 and 1970 was huge. And then I think productivity gains in the physical industrial arena in 1920 and 1970 was much different than innovation in the services consumer economy that software has promoted. What I think is important is that the whole idea that generative AI is going to be good for the middle class really relies on generative AI contributing pretty substantially to overall productivity.
Right.
So if we want it to be a technology that drives prosperity, it will need to be a technology that is far outperforms the internet in terms of its contribution to productivity. And what people often forget is that although the internet changed so many aspects of our life and how we interact with each other and how we do our business, it didn't drive productivity gains all that much compared to the previous period. Right, productivity was actually far better before the internet in that 1920 to 1970 period than the computer and internet era. So, like, can this technology actually get us more than the internet? I think our baseline assumption has to be no. That actually would be a good case to get us as much as the internet, and that to outperform it would really require something remarkable in how it changes our physical world, the way that a manufacturing revolution did. So I think there's a lot more that we would need to see to get to that huge productivity um, transformation, and it would take a really long time, right? We're talking about 50-year periods here. So yes, I'm really encouraged because David is such a incredible scholar and such a smart analyst of these issues. I like when he's optimistic. So this is really encouraging. But I think I'm looking for the points of evidence that I laid out before that becomes true.
And as a layperson's read of Dr. Otter's work, it felt like he was pretty open ended as well about this being a possibility, not a likeliness.
Mm.
It wasn't a clear prediction that we can be excited about optimistic futures.
Yeah, and I think one of his points is that there's a lot of choices to be made. That
Right.
and he works with Daron Acemoglu, another MIT economist, and their suggestion is that this technology could be implemented. Companies, regulators could choose to steer this technology in a way that is more worker friendly, that
Right.
actually leads to better jobs. What I think is going to be a really challenging job for regulators, but also in terms of your audience, for people in workforce development, it's like, you know, what are the decision points, right? Like, what leverage do we actually have? Is it like a job description? Can we help get companies to adopt a new job description that's actually a better kind of call center worker. I tend to think that is a really important and underutilized strategy, is that companies don't really redesign their jobs that often, right? So jobs shift over time. We talk about like the new job being a prompt engineer. But if you look at manufacturing, which I study most, a machinist has been a machinist for a long time. Now,
Yeah.
the tasks that a machinist takes on are quite different, but there's been a reluctance to redesign jobs on the factory floor to welcome new skills, to make them really fundamentally better jobs, change their wage scales, change their starting, the educational requirements, which you mentioned. So I do think that there are opportunities to rethink job design, which is more of an organizational problem than a technology one.
Gotcha. Really helpful. I know you've spoken to some folks in education who are trying to get a handle on what they should be doing, what they should be advising their members in higher education on how to react to the changes that we're seeing with AI. Can you just give me a sense? I'm certainly not seeing a lot of action other than embedding AI skills in programs. But beyond that, what are you hearing? What kind of needs are surfacing?
Yeah. So I see this energy at the top and at the grassroots and educational organizations and also in companies. So at the top, there's typically a task force where there are meetings of talking about what we should do, what the key questions are. And at the grassroots, there are a lot of people who are just using the technology, who are just out there. They're, generating images with DALL-E. They're, getting documents summarized with ChatGPT, et cetera, et cetera. Now, how do you balance those two ideas, like the big strategic initiative and
Right.
then people already using this technology in various ways? In companies, I think the most interesting experiments have been companies that are trying to monitor and really impute the best and most promising grassroots experiments that are happening within the company. And I haven't really seen that yet with educational institutions, that there isn't really a curiosity of like, yeah, how are our students using this? Is this really, it's more of like, can we prevent our students from using it in a certain way? So I feel like there's a more maybe reactive attitude within educational institutions. And then there's also, I think, this question about how the curricula should change or whether we should create new programs in AI or generative AI. And this is a question for community colleges and four-year institutions alike. Not my expertise. I've seen a couple models though that might be useful. So one is a more, I would say, integrated model where rather than create new programs, you try to examine how these new technologies might manifest in every different discipline. So for humanities courses, looking at how the presence of this new technology might change the way we think about longstanding topics in the humanities. Of course, changing assignments so that you can develop the same skills and the skills aren't, you know, and they don't atrophy with the presence of generative AI. This is one thing that I thought MIT has done really well with ethics and new technology. So we have a program called Social and Ethical Responsibilities of Computing. And rather than make that a course standing on its own, instead the effort was to embed modules of ethics and responsibility into all sorts of engineering courses, computer science courses, et cetera. The second question that I have, which I've debated it, I don't know whether it's right, but my sense is that it's unclear to me whether using generative AI is really a skill that we should be teaching in colleges or universities at all. The first reason why might be obvious is it's not really like it's a skill to interpret what the algorithm gives you, but it's not really like some people say prompting's a skill. Unclear to me whether you need that much of a course in it. And part of the reason I say that is because these top companies that are ready to deploy this all through their organization, they have trainings that are like 12 minutes.
Yeah.
It's not like they have a week-long course on this, and they feel comfortable
Hmm.
because the tool is designed to be so easy to use. Really, the training needs to be on how do you interpret it, which is about domain expertise. It's not about, how do you prompt, how does one prompt get you more effective answer than another?
Well, Dr. Armstrong, thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise. Obviously, a lot of fascinating tangents I could have taken you on. We barely scratched the surface, I know, but I will certainly be following your work. The Industrial Performance Center at MIT, the Work of the Future initiative for folks listening. But again, just really thank you for sharing this.
Thanks so much, Paul.
Well, Ben gave us a lot to think about there. So much of it felt fresh and new to me, which is surprising given all the noise around AI. Next up is Katy Knight. She'll help us talk through what we just heard and give us plenty more to discuss. Stick around. Without further ado, I'm here speaking with Katy Knight. Katy, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me today.
So I know the Siegel Family Endowment is interested in AI, its impact on the workplace. Can you give me a sense of your key priorities right now?
Yeah, so Siegel Family Endowment is focused on understanding and shaping the impact of technology on society. And right now, a lot of that is artificial intelligence related. There are other technologies, past, present, and future, that are also shaping and reshaping our lives. But we are thinking about all of them through the lens of how they impact the way we sort of learn, work, and live. So we have these three verticals: learning, which is where a lot of our education, traditional K-12 education focused work lives; workforce, which is about both, current workers and broader economic development; and then infrastructure, which crosses so many things, including the other two portfolios, but is also about really reimagining what infrastructure needs to be for a future where more people have the opportunity to thrive in an innovation and tech driven world and economy.
Well, thanks for that. Obviously, a lot of interlapping issues in those three buckets. So before today, I didn't realize that you all support Dr. Ben Armstrong's work at the Work of the Future at MIT. I have not seen much work that rivals what they're doing, quite frankly. I know you've listened to that interview, but I wonder if we could just start with Ben's general take that this looks like past technology. He said, the personal computer, the internet, cloud technology, generally similar parameters so far. He had lots of caveats. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's hard for me to disagree with the brilliant minds of the folks at MIT and in the Work of the Future initiative, although sometimes I do. But I think I'm very aligned with the perspective that this is not, especially, the this we're talking about being generative AI, which has been in the public consciousness in a new way in the last 18 months or so, that this is not um, a full sea change. It is very much an additional technology capacity, and it is definitely having impact and will lead to change, but it's not something entirely unfamiliar to us. And we can and should try to learn from what we did wrong in the past with technology adoption to get some of this right.
Well, I love the way you frame that in part because it's different than I think a lot of, at the beginning of those 18 months, it was we've just created a new species and we're all going to die or something like that. It's a bit less scary. I wonder, as somebody who works with a lot of folks across a lot of different fields, do you think we've gotten past the scary phase a little bit?
I don't think we've gotten past the scary. I've got a new model for how I've been talking about generative AI that I think helps eliminate some of the fear. I talk about it as being really similar to Wikipedia. When Wikipedia first launched, if you were a teacher or student, you may remember this magical website now has all of the information I need. So, why should I learn about history? I can just look it up on Wikipedia. Why should I go to an Encyclopedia Britannica and go to the index? I can just search it on Wikipedia. Any topic is at my fingertips. And that moment could have been this huge sea change in learning. We could have thrown away the history textbooks and said, oh, it's all right here, crowdsource. But what happened instead is that we took a learning moment and said, well, wait a minute, crowdsource knowledge, that's really great. But this is how you review that sort of knowledge. This is how you learn the difference between a primary and secondary source. This is how you read footnotes, right? So we took this moment in time that felt like a massive change and very similar, I think, to some of the conversations we have about generative AI in like higher ed institutions where people are saying, how do we keep the students from cheating? What if instead we asked how we teach them to use a new technology in a way that's beneficial and that they can be literate with it in a way that doesn't make it so that they are just reliant on it as a new source of knowledge, but that they understand how to interpret the knowledge that they're getting through it, right? So I think that approach, thinking about this isn't necessarily a brand new scary thing. It is an amalgamation of a lot of stuff that's been going on presented in a new way.
In terms of helping educators think about it that way, this is a big question, but who do you see in a good place to help with that framing? Obviously, I think I've put my cards out. I think philanthropy has a role, hopefully, education associations. But what are you seeing? What needs to be out there?
Yeah. So I think there are a few different levers and pieces of this, right? And so when it comes to just general AI literacy, I think there are a lot of really good resources. One that I actually think is very accessible for just your average person is IBM's got a really good What is Generative AI explainer on their website that I've shared with people. I think just if you're trying to understand this from a very basic level, check it out. I'm not being paid to say that at all, but they do have a pretty good resource. I think though, in a broader sense, there's a lot of opportunity to get AI literate through different resources that, like you said, some of the education associations are putting out, ISTE, there's the resources from the government specifically around ed tech in education and what sort of AI technology that we should be using, like the National Ed Tech Plan. So I think those things exist. And depending on your role in all of this, there are different resources for you to design everything from AI use policies to teaching with these new tools. But fundamentally, I think it's on educators to approach this just like they would approach any other new topic without a fear driving them. And that is what I think has been the most challenging part is we talk a lot, especially in philanthropy, about, we've got to teach educators to do this thing or that thing or inform them about this thing or that thing. And it becomes larger than it may need to be because the topic seems so complex. But ultimately, this is not much more complex than some of the things we've been talking about with computers for decades now that we wanted educators to have a better sense of. So how can we think about, computational thinking and computer literacy that we've been focused on for a long time and how relevant that is to AI and make it more of a continuing thread rather than this is yet another new topic. Like the things that are important, I think, are ultimately that you can sort of line them up, right? Basic literacy, basic numeracy, and sort of computational fluency are three really key skills that I think are just foundational for the world that we have. Two of those we already knew about. And the third one is not that new. It's just there's new flavors to it.
Absolutely. And I'm fully with you on that. That kind of, this is part of a multi-decade techification of education in totally new ways or in iterative ways. But, I think about a K-12 educator who asked me the question, I think maybe you and I talked about this before, of, this reminds me of that movie before where everybody said the iPad was going to change everything. And now we basically have to yank screens out of kids' hands. And can you tell me why this is different? And I feel like it is. I feel like these tools are obviously different than hardware in the classroom. I kind of wonder where you stand on that continuum.
Yeah, I think it's a both and for me, like so many of these things are. It is different. I think what is interesting to me in this moment, as opposed to some of the previous hardware and software efforts, is the iPads thing. In many ways, that was Apple wanting those products in the hands of the next generation of young people as a marketing play. And I've worked inside of a tech company and I know how that works. And I'm not saying it's driven by malintent, but it is the reality that it all comes back to just getting these users and being able to sell these things. And so I think what's interesting to me about AI is that this is not driven by any one company. And it's not necessarily about this, iPads or Chromebooks being the tool for schools. It's
Right.
more about a general hype machine coming from many companies where their press releases are sort of driving the coverage that we get of what AI is and can do. And it is a change that's I think the fundamentals, right? The foundational computer science knowledge that we have and the way that we apply that computer science knowledge to new products and services and platforms is changing. It's the knowledge is increasing, the compute power is growing, all of these things are getting more robust. And so that is super relevant beyond any one product. So there's a bit of like, this is not necessarily about flipping education on its head, K-12 education, but it's not quite just like one product or one sort of set of products that are being slipped into schools through a back door. Like there is a relevance to society.
Right. Absolutely. That makes sense. We've all heard Ben's take on things at this point. I was not surprised, but I guess I was braced by how incremental the impact on occupations and jobs are at this point. And again, this is somebody who has his team have seen real numbers from real companies and still not a lot of clear answers. And even the assumptions that you might make based on what we do know, in my case, was wrong, as you heard in that interview. And I buy his take on that. I've reversed my opinion on whether customer service gaining skills quickly is a good thing. You were watching this closely too. Do you think he's generally correct that at this point it's very hard to tell, even about things like the medical profession?
Yeah, I think that's very correct, and I think that's why these research teams are comprised of technologists, computer scientists, economists, and social scientists because there are all these elements in the way that the world of work changes, the way labor changes is not just dependent on the technology. And I think when it comes to technology, we often try to reduce things back to this very basic, well, did the technology change it or not? Will the technology erase the jobs or will it not? But we're forgetting that there are sort of complex factors at play, economic factors, capitalist factors, but really also just humans. And we're not rational and we are making choices and responding to things emotionally. And I think that is what struck me about what we were hearing in Dr. Armstrong's comments is that you might think here's a technology that can do the medical imaging review in a way that will make a doctor's life easier. But the doctor may be resistant because they've got a workflow and they've got a sense of how they evaluate these things. And they're not trusting a technology to just replace their knowledge. So we have a very simple, this will augment this profession, this will eliminate this profession sort of calculus that we do looking just at the technology and not thinking about all of the other factors that shift work and shift the way that people are engaging in work in different ways.
It totally makes sense. One of the things I really was hoping to find in my reporting was areas where we as humans have agency to help ensure that where there are opportunities here, that folks who face licensing barriers or credential barriers coming from low income backgrounds might have access to better jobs, where the technology makes that possible and where policy and practice can help there. But at this point, not seeing a lot of places where even that lever is clear. Like, medical imaging, you could see a different type of role coming out, but I have not found people who are working on that. And I wonder what you think about, are we at the point now where there are bets to place on how to get that done to help people, or is it too early?
I think we are close to being able to think about this, but to place some of these bets. But I think we also have to look at it through maybe a slightly different lens where we get down to the most basic. So, like when we're talking about the medical profession, for example, and I'm not the most well versed in this, but the basic understanding I have, we have a need in this country for more skilled home care, right? For more skilled home nurses, for LPNs, and there's also these incredible bureaucratic hurdles and limits on what a lower skilled or lower licensed in-home medical professional can do. And I've heard and been a part of a lot of conversations in workforce development about kind of those policy barriers and how might we upskill people so that they can transition from being an LPN to a nurse to an RN and so on.
Right.
Are we looking at ways that generative AI and other forms of AI might help with the most basic skills, help eliminate maybe some of the policy hurdles that make it impossible for someone with lower skills to gain the practical experience they need to take that next step?
Mhm.
I think there's a lot more promise in the forms of technology that still keep a human in the loop somehow, and that's just true across the board, but I think particularly in this instance, there's both a comfort and a scale factor, I think, with humans. So if we don't think about AI as a replacement or a standalone being able to change people's lives, how can AI help a human change another human's skills? How can AI help a human teach three people instead of one person how to do something? Like, I think those are the levers that I'd like to see us experiment with in philanthropy with some of the programs that we work with on how they may apply these new tools in those ways and help the most currently underserved in terms of access to skills and training, the people with the least time and the least money, to gain some of them in a more practical way by trying to make it less burdensome to do hands-on learning in your current job.
Absolutely. And I think even a layperson like me can see professions where that might play out in a way that is good for society. I talked with Dr. Armstrong about his colleague David Otter's predictions that this could be good for the middle class. But of course, in the same sense, you think about the easy supply for some of these skills, which could lead to wage depression, has been described. I mean, we can see you get somebody to do this work more efficiently, and then you lay other people off. I mean, there's some dark scenarios too. And, I kind of wonder where you are at this point. I know it's very hard, and your level of optimism about maybe cracking some barriers.
I feel cautiously optimistic. My highest level of optimism I possess as a philanthropy professional. We were actually talking about this a bit in an internal meeting. I was talking to John Irons, our head of research. He is an economist and previously worked on the future of workers portfolio at Ford. So he has a lot to say about these topics. And we were talking about worker power, and a lot of philanthropy and nonprofit work is sort of defaulting to worker power as the answer to how maybe some of these things can be solved. And we settled on the idea that that's a really important component, but it can't be the only thing that we rely on to make sure that AI and other technologies are having a fairer impact across the workforce. So we have to be thinking about more comprehensive policy solutions and tech design solutions. I really think there's a lot of opportunity if we engage more directly with people in their jobs and ask them, what could technology be useful for, or even just what are the gaps, what are your needs, and then design toward that. We just don't do that enough in the tech industry. And I think there are a lot of really interesting and important efforts to try to change that design equation rather than here's a chatbot, figure out how to apply it to your work. Here's a problem that we have in this industry, or here's a training that we'd like to solve, or how can technology be helpful? What do we need first? And then what are the tools rather than here's a bunch of tools, figure out something to do with them.
Yeah, and that obviously would be a big change. I mean, I think it's about creating a market now as opposed to serving one. When you talk about that, I of course go to the tools that have application that we're seeing already from generative AI. I mean, I think there is a lot of excitement about customized tools and how they could help with advising, for an example. But these things aren't going to be cheap, probably. And I do wonder, like, are you worried first of all about equal access to AI tools and their benefits? And again, where philanthropy could play a role.
I think access to AI is incredibly dependent on access to the internet. We have not solved that problem at scale in the United States, much less globally. So we can't rely on AI or any other emerging technology like it to be a savior if we know factually that there are just a ton of people who will not have access at home. And that when you think about just the necessary computing power to really play with AI, to really dig in and create your own custom chatbot, it's just not available in a home where the primary internet access is through a cell phone. And so we have to be thinking about addressing that problem. It's part of why I had originally said in the foundation, we're not necessarily focused on the traditional aspects of the digital divide in terms of the hard assets, the physical infrastructure assets. We've returned to that question a bit to start thinking about the world beyond broadband and how we try to re-engage with efforts to get access to more people because AI cannot be. I have my doubts about whether it'd be a great equalizer in general, but it absolutely can't if there's not access to technology, to the internet in people's homes. So that's one piece of it. And then the other piece is just how people have access to AI. If your only access is through kind of a public free chat GPT version of a tool instead of the back end of being able to play with and understand more of what a large language model is and what AI does and how it's built. And so those sort of divides are what worry me is how are we teaching? And again, it comes back to computational thinking and computing literacy in a big way. How are we making sure that we're not just giving kids in under-resourced schools the free version of a tool and all they ever know is it's a magic black box, and then giving another set of young people access to understand how the box was built and what's actually inside of it. And I think there's opportunity for our community colleges, for libraries in particular. Libraries have been really key in digital divide issues in a way that I don't think people recognize. So can we fund libraries do that work more? Community colleges, other sort of, we talk about civic knowledge infrastructure internally at SFE. And so what's the knowledge infrastructure we need to get more people access to AI knowledge is an important question.
Absolutely. And it's hard not to see a scenario where a lot of effort is going to be needed to prevent the wealth gap in education from widening with this. I mean, you think about elite, highly selective universities' access to custom tools versus community college systems. It's going to be tough. You talked about kind of some of the low hanging fruit here on AI literacy, the IBM tools. I hadn't seen that actually. I know Google has some new ones this week, which I'm hearing good things about. I wonder though, thinking about school leaders or people, pretty much anyone in the space, I've heard a lot of people saying, just play around with these tools. Even if you're like a community college chancellor, you need to have some personal idea of how to use them or what's possible. Do you buy that? And is that something that you practice as well?
Yeah, I don't use chat bots as much as people might expect given my role, but I have been playing with these tools. And I definitely would advise people who expect this to play a role in their job somehow to be playing with them. But with the mindset, I think that this is a large language model, not a large knowledge model. So when you're playing with it, ask yourself, what am I doing with a tool that is really good at predicting language? Not what am I doing with a tool that has all the knowledge of the internet on it? Because what the AI has learned is about a pattern recognition related to what word should come next in this sentence. And then there's some randomization. And that's my oversimplified perspective. But I think playing with these tools with the right mindset allows you to see their limitations a little bit faster and engage with them a little differently in my experience.
Well, I think that's a really important grounding to start with. And frankly, something that I don't always do a good job of. I think about that language prediction as being the key tool, but when you're actually in the moment, you can forget that. Well, anything I didn't ask that I should have here? Any last thoughts for folks?
Well, I think just as I'm looking to what philanthropy can be doing here, I think it's really important that we not try to reinvent the wheel and consider all of this as brand new. There are new components, but there's also a lot that we've learned from in the past. And we don't have to know everything about AI in order to make moves and place some bets and do some work here. And I think we're often inclined to wait until there's more research or wait until there's a better developed theory of change, but this is not necessarily that moment. So let's engage and dig in and be in the messy part because that's how we end up shaping the technology with that collective feedback to industry and by building our own tools because we know how they work. So I'm excited for us to take that approach and to be thinking that way and not just like, all right, we've got to figure this out sometime in the next 5 years.
That's a great call to action. This is definitely the time for humans to shape this impact. Katy, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. It's been great to pick your brain about this, and I hope we can keep in touch, maybe have you back on the show at some point.
Yeah, I'm always happy to talk about these things, and I'm really grateful for you having me on to do it.
Thanks, Katy. Thanks for tuning into The Cusp. We're available wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe. You can visit us at thecusp.ai. The launch of this podcast was made possible by the collective philanthropic support of the Walmart Foundation, GitLab Foundation, Cognizant, and the KPOR Center. Thanks to our supporters and to you all for listening. Catch you next time.